Okay. I think we've got a nice critical mass here of people. So let's get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Chelsea Lake. I'm a member of the events team at Politics and Prose Bookstore, and I'd like to welcome you to PNP Live. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. At any point during the event, you can click on the link that I'll be dropping momentarily into the chat to purchase The Promise. You can ask a question by clicking on the Q&A feature. That feature is located at the bottom of your screen. We'll also have the chat open, but Q&A is for your questions, chat for comments. We'll try to get to everybody's questions, but I apologize in advance if we don't have time to address yours. We are delighted to offer closed captioning for this event via Zoom's auto captioning service. To access captions, simply click on the live transcripts option also at the bottom of your screen. Now it is my pleasure to introduce this afternoon's speakers. Damon Galgut was born in Pretoria. His 2003 novel, The Good Doctor, won the Commonwealth Writers' Prize, Africa region, and was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize. In a Strange Room was also shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize. In 2021, Galgut won the Booker Prize for The Promise. In 2013, Galgut was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Letters. This afternoon, he will be in conversation with Colm Tóibín. Tóibín is the author of 10 novels, including The Magician, his most recent novel, The Master, winner of the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, Brooklyn, winner of the Costa Book Award, The Testament of Mary, and Nora Webster, as well as 2 short story collections and several books of criticism. He is the Irene and Sidney B. Silverman Professor of the Humanities at Columbia University, 3 times shortlisted for the Booker Prize. He lives in Dublin and New York. Gentlemen, the screen is yours.
Damon, how are you? I want to begin by congratulating you on winning the Booker Prize. We've been in correspondence about it, but I think that there are people like me because I read the book before the prize. And so I feel sort of included in the general idea that, as soon as I read this book, it was very clear that it was absolutely marvelous. And I got nothing but pleasure from it. And congratulations again. I want to start by asking you about reading. When I was growing up in Ireland, when I was starting to buy books for myself, when I was 15 or 16, and I was curious about books, I would not have bought an Irish book willingly or knowingly. In other words, that if I was in Dublin and I had a book token or some money, I was interested in anything except Irish rain, Irish weather, Irish Catholicism, Irish misery, Irish history. And that included Joyce. I would have not been interested. And I was interested in reading, Kafka, Hemingway, anything that seemed European or glamorously American. And I'm wondering if you could give us an account of being a teenager, being a literary teenager in South Africa, and what your reading was, or what outside world, or indeed inside world, you were finding in books.
Yeah, you take me back. I think there's a similar sort of reservation in South Africa about reading homegrown products. It may be slightly different because I'm hearing in your description that maybe what you didn't want to read, you were avoiding because it was too familiar, Irish rain, etc. And you were looking for something exotic and elsewhere. I think in South Africa, there's more of a cultural cringe factor in the sense that people don't believe that we can do the things that people do in Europe, essentially. So there's the sense that something has to be validated back in the mother country, in our case, England, I guess, before it can be taken seriously here. And that is quite a persistent avoidance on South Africans' part, to the extent that, The Promise did not get reviewed in South Africa until it landed on the shortlist, and then it could be taken seriously enough in the English press. The Afrikaans press is a different entity. I was probably reading the usual teenage fare mixed up with some more unlikely offerings. I was reading the sort of stuff you'd expect in your early teens, like, The Lord of the Rings, and trying to imitate it too. Quite a lot of Wilbur Smith, who recently died. Wilbur Smith doesn't count as South African because he's exotic, I guess. His version of Africa isn't one we know. But I think my serious reading took me into the modernists, I guess. I mean, I didn't recognize them as the modernists back then. My reading still is probably very naive. I go where, instincts or my literary nose takes me. And I was very, very engrossed, absorbed, reverential about William Faulkner, about Patrick White, Australian novelist, and a little bit later about Samuel Beckett when I discovered him. My first encounter with South African writing, which I took really seriously, was with J.M. Coetzee, and that was in my late teens. I was 18. And the first Coetzee that I read was In the Heart of the Country, and I was absolutely blown away by it in the way you might expect, which is to say, here's a South African, he has an absolutely South African name, as flat as you could get, and he's writing in a way that I would not expect anybody from hereabouts to write, in ways that were, kind of experimental and avant-garde by European standards. So, and what impressed me the most about him, I think, because all my prior South African reading had shown the traditional trajectory under apartheid was of somebody, a white person who realized, had the scales drop from their eyes and realized the profound error of our political ways, and came to insight and realization. Whereas Coetzee consistently showed me South African characters central to his story who were flawed and questionable in much the same way that non-heroic figures would be. And that felt to me intensely human and recognizable. So it's a bit of a spread out answer to your much more focused question, but I don't think my reading was focused itself. I was just sort of clutching at whatever was available, and what was available was very often kind of random and eclectic.
You mentioned Faulkner, and in conversations we've had, you mentioned Virginia Woolf, and I was wondering if you could take us through. I wonder if what I feel with The Promise is that the innovations in the book, the narrative interventions by the author, which, say, James Wood wrote about very beautifully in The New Yorker, the idea that there are times when you are working as an omniscient narrator and something is being explained and you break the fourth wall for a second and you intervene. And there's another voice comes in, which is a sort of, in a way, a sort of metafictional voice saying, no, this is fiction. And actually, I can change this if I want to. And these interventions occur throughout the book. My feeling about this is that it's organic, in other words, you were working. And one day, as you were working, this thought occurred to you. You tried it, you put it in, and you left it in for a while. And you thought, well, I'll read it in the morning. If it doesn't work, I'll take it out again. Or else you decided, I'm tired writing, fiction that attempts to establish verisimilitude in sentence after sentence after sentence. And I think it's a tedious system, and I want to do something to disrupt it, because my reading of authors who have disrupted it has been rich. And so I just wonder if you could just take us through how this occurred, and why it occurred, and what decisions were made, or indeed, did it just occur of its own accord?
It's a pretty central question, really, where this book's concerned. I mean, I think both the examples that you put forward are true, essentially. I've been reluctant for some time to to write in the third person, to write a third person omniscient narrator, because it's felt very confining. So in a certain sense, you know, like with A Good Doctor, where you're working in the first person, you can play a literary game because you're establishing a narrator who's essentially untrustworthy. So it opens up a sort of space behind the book, as it were, in which events that are being recounted may have happened differently. And the fun for me there was in conjuring that sense of unease or lack of trust between the reader and the narrator. With a third person narration, one that, as you so well put it, you know, you're establishing a sense of truth and authority and stability in the narration. You're essentially canceling out any games. You're saying, this is how it is. I'm telling you this happened, and then it was followed by this event and that event, and so thought that, and so on, which is all very well for a certain kind of book, but it wasn't the sort of book that I wanted to write. So I did begin in that mode, and it was intensely frustrating to me. I don't know how to put it except to say that my sense was that if I chose a particular point of view or a particular tone, I was excluding by implication all the other points of view or range of tone that I could have introduced. So, you know, there are infinite ways to describe the world, clearly, and one has to commit to, you know, very particular ones if you're writing a novel. But my feeling was that I was narrowing my options. So, you know, I guess this is what the modernists must have felt in their time, that you could burst the world open into multiple perspectives, and that there were literary ways whereby you could do that. I didn't quite know what those ways might be. And then fortuitously, I got offered a chance to do a couple of drafts of the film script, which took me away from my book. I did the movie quite honestly because I needed money. I'd got myself into a hole, and I wanted to keep going. Not, you know, in the hole, out of the hole. So I did these two drafts of the film script. And of course, the logic of film is entirely different to the logic of prose. Film is by its very nature not committed to a single viewpoint. It moves constantly from one perspective to another, one point of view to another. That's how a camera works. And you have to be thinking in that way if you're writing a film script, because, you know, you shift the emphasis and the weight of the story if you're looking at something from a distance as opposed to close up, and so on. You know, obviously a lot of those decisions get made in the direction on the day, but you have to enter that mode of thinking if you want to write a script, and abandon language, incidentally, as you know, the central basis of storytelling, because language is the least important element in a film script. So I did two drafts of the script. I don't know that I did, you know, an especially good script in either case, but it was fortuitous for me because I brought back to my novel, when I returned to it, something of that mindset. And I suddenly realized that it need not be overpoweringly difficult to make the narration move in the same fluid way that I'd been making, you know, the cinematic narrative move. So, as you again very well put it, I started to play with that, with a sense of unease and uncertainty, and indeed the knowledge that I might wake up in the morning and find this, you know, one of many mistaken roads I'd started down. But in the morning, it still looked interesting to me, and I persisted with it. At this point in the narrative, I guess the most present figure as a sort of literary ghost was probably Beckett, because as you'll know, you know, his central focus was always really on storytelling and the artificial nature of storytelling. You cannot make these narrative leaps from one perspective to another without drawing attention to the fact that a narrative is an artificial construction. Whereas in a more traditional approach, what you're trying to do is erase that impression. You're trying to give the illusion of authority and remove any sense of the narrator being an obstructive presence You want the narrator to feel like a pane of glass, a transparent pane through which the reader is viewing true action. But of course, it's an entirely different game if what you're doing is drawing to the reader's attention all the time the fact that what they're reading is artificial and can be corrected with the stroke of the pen, as it were. So yeah, it was one of those sort of serendipitous discoveries that fitted very well, for whatever reason, both with my narrative and with my own instinctive grasping for another way of telling, a story in this particular voice.
I think in the book you also go back to some of the early roots of fiction writing, particularly Jane Austen, where she always needs a crowd. In other words, to get solitude going, to get the sensibility right of her more sensible characters, she needs to show what they're like when they're fully socialized, not just in the family, but beyond the family at a dance. So she's very good at a dance because she gets who's rejecting who's watching, who's standing to the side, and who's dancing their heart out. And what you do in this book is you use the funeral as the way of doing this. In other words, the structure of the book occurs around a number of funerals over a long period of time. But the funeral itself, the way in which people gather, who's in the room, who comes in, who goes out of the room, really it does belong, doesn't it, to the early days of fiction?
I guess, yeah. I'd never thought about it in those terms, but you put your finger on something. I mean, funerals and weddings are social occasions when families sort of come together from all over with all their attendant, foibles and motives. So there is that social element. At the same time, Austen is a writer who would have taken a lot of trouble to establish her scenes in a very deep-rooted, realistic mode, I would imagine. Whereas this mode of storytelling, of moving very rapidly around, sort of works against that. What I'm trying to say, I guess, is that if you feel free in a scene to move between the perspectives of the people you consider to be your central characters to the perspective of someone who's actually quite peripheral, it becomes tempting to see how far you can push that periphery. So you may not be keeping your focus on the family or the group at the heart of the story. You may be tempted suddenly to introduce the viewpoint of, I don't know, the gravedigger or the mortician or some arbitrary side person who has no real place at the funeral. And I was subject to that temptation a lot of the time, because it allows you to set a very unlikely perspective or viewpoint against one that's much more predictable. And I like that sort of sudden movement from one to another. But of course, there's a danger with that sort of storytelling that you lose your story, right? Because you need the sense of a certain central group of characters in a situation to keep the vehicle of the story moving forward. So I was continually sort of moving out from that and then returning to it. But I guess the game for me became, how far out can you move before you come back again without losing the sense that, death and burial are at the center of this narrative?
Damon, I wonder if you could give us a flavor of the book, just if you could read a passage from the book, just to give us a sense of what your voice is like when you read it, or what it's
Sure.
like when you read it.
Sure, and I apologize if I've bored you with this reading before, Colin, but it does convey something of what we've been discussing. This scene occurs early on, and it deals with the family, the Swart family, at the heart of the book, when they're in bed, asleep and dreaming. Upstairs in the bedrooms, there's a flickering going on. Pa's mattress is a raft, tossing on a current of uneasy dreams. He has taken a sedative prescribed by Dr. Raff, and it keeps his head just under the surface, looking at images refracted from above. His wife is in many of them, but altered somehow, a bit squiff. A trace in her of another person altogether, someone he doesn't know. How can this be, he cries to her, you're dead. That's an unforgivable thing to say, Marnie, she tells him. I'm very hurt. His heart is wrung like an old rag. I'm sorry, I'm sorry. Through the wall beside him, just an outstretched arm away, Astrid ripples in her sleep. She has recently lost her virginity to a boy she met at the ice rink, and sex flows through her like a golden wind. She has forgotten the pain, though it's part of the shimmer around the faces of young men with their bristly beards, and in this dream around the face of Dean de Wet in particular, whose mouth is a pink color it doesn't have in waking life, thrilling her deep inside, down where everything meets. In the guest bedroom, Tani Marina dozes and starts, dozes and starts. She achieves only the beginning of a dream in which she's on a picnic with P.W. Botha at an old fort somewhere, and he's feeding her strawberries with thick white fingers before she gets woken by a kick. At home in Menlo Park, she doesn't share a bed with Oki, who lies twitching beside her like a hit-and-run victim waiting for medical assistance. What a thought, Marina, sis on you, but you can't help what you think. It's only human, and far worse has gone through your mind. Oh, yes, it has. Her husband's foot touches hers. She pulls her foot away. Terrible to flinch from what you once briefly loved or thought you did or wanted to think you did, but are shackled to, regardless, for life. At the other end of the chain, Oki jerks like a dancing bear. He doesn't dream, not exactly, unless the shallows he splashes through are a sort of dream, but nothing quite happens. There's just the question of color changing all the time. A bubble rises from the seabed, becomes a breaking of wind against the flank of his wife, who stiffens and flares her nostrils in protest. And in her bedroom at the end of the passage, Amor lies sleepless, hour after hour. Not unusual for her, believe me. Every night before she drifts off, her mind must move outward from where her body is based, on its back in bed, to reach out and touch certain objects in particular places in a specific order. Only when she's done that can she relax enough to let go. But tonight it doesn't work. Other images from the day are too powerful. They come jostling in. Miss Starkey's pressed together lips, Lucas's stick hitting the ground, the sore place on her arm where her aunt pinched her, so much rage in her fingers, sending out its little pulse of pain into the universe. Notice me, I am here, Amor Swart, 1986. May tomorrow never come. I'll leave it there, but I hope that, conveys.
Thank you very much. We've been talking about prose, and I think we should talk about politics since we're in politics and prose. And I just want to start with the title of the book and say that if you published a book in the United States called A Promise, people would wonder what you were talking about. And if you did the same in France, if perhaps if you published it in East Germany, people would have some idea that there was once a promise in somewhere like Germany with reunification. But I think in South Africa, or readers all over the world, when they see a novel from South Africa called The Promise, will have some sense that you have a great deal of opportunity now to be ironic, or indeed to enter into the spirit of what was a promise. So if you could just take us through where, just start with this, something personal. Where were you in that period, and what were you writing and what were you thinking when Mandela was released from Robben Island, and when all that business began of hope and what Nadine Gordimer in her book, taking from Seamus Heaney, calls hope in history?
Yeah, ironically and sadly for me, I was not in the country. I had just embarked on what I thought of as my sort of world tour in my 20s, and was in London, and along with the rest of the world had to watch these events from a distance on television. Remarkable events, obviously, and I felt them in a way that, I guess most people around me were not feeling them. I mean, it's very hard to convey how impossible all of that felt just shortly before it happened. None of us in my generation believed that in our lifetimes Mandela would ever come out of prison, let alone, that the ANC would be unbanned, the Communist Party would be unbanned, and that free democratic elections would happen in South Africa. There was no such sense. So, there was an absolutely unreal feeling to all of those events. And also to the speed with which they unfolded. Of course, none of that was straightforward, and I did do my world tour, such as it was, and returned to South Africa while we were still in that very, very tense build-up to the first elections. But there really was a sense back then, with all the attendant dangers, those were not to be diminished, but there really was a sense that everything was different and that anything was possible. That feeling is not so pervasive now. The sense is much more that time and opportunity have been squandered to such a degree that even to kind of rewind to an earlier point in the road is not within our reach any longer. We have to get by with what we have. Is that a full enough answer for you?
Yes, it is. And I want to ask, this is an important question. I haven't heard you on this before, and it's, we've talked a lot, but I haven't actually asked you this directly. Is it possible that someone could argue that you were circling this story for a very long time, and that there were novels in which you were deliberately not going there, in which you were remaining in a dream world, in a very personal world, or indeed in Arctic Summer, that you were dealing with matters that were literary, old stories. That is it possible that you have been evading this central question of South African promise for at least 3 books, and this gives this new book all the greater intensity, because in a way you have opened a space that you were shutting off for perhaps very good artistic reasons up to now? Or is that a very, very crude reading of your trajectory?
No, I think it's quite a subtle reading. It's of course, in no conscious way was I trying to avoid the writing of this book. But you could say, I'm just trying to think back, because events in South Africa have moved with such rapidity, actually, that one's feelings about the country and one's connection to it evolves with the same sort of speed. I did believe, along with the rest of South Africa back in the 90s, that we were in a new golden age, that as I say, everything was different. That sense of the future, that sense of promise has been eroded and chipped away, in subsequent years, as we've watched with growing cynicism, a lot of political maneuvering, and a lot of non-delivery, and so on. Let's not rehash it. But I guess the feeling was more from a writer's point of view that the old, what had set the benchmark for South African writing, Gordimer and Brink at a certain point, and then Coetzee, who was far more...
Sorry, just if you could be clear, that's Andre Brink, who wrote a what's it called?
Dry White Season.
Yeah.
Dry White Season, Rumors of Rain. Yeah, he was of course a very important and powerful figure in South African writing, but he was one of the few. That, as I say, what I associate with writers like that is a kind of literary journey to understanding that the country we were living in was not what it claimed to be. That was sort of changed with the writing of Coetzee, who, as I say, introduced a kind of morally questionable note even into the right side of the struggle. But there was a sense, I think, that even Coetzee's writing, Coetzee's Disgrace is a book that was very much an adieu to the new South Africa. I think Coetzee could only really have written that as a kind of a bit of farewell note. It was his announcement of why he found it, I think, hard or impossible to live in the new South Africa. But there was no strong sense in a literary way of what sort of books the new South Africa might produce. It was uncharted territory. In that sense, a gift. And I guess I tried to venture into it in a tentative sort of way with books like the Good Doctor. But then I think you have you could certainly make a case that I was actively trying to avoid certain political questions with books like In a Strange Room or Arctic Summer, where, other subjects were very much at the forefront. So this is a long and I hope not evasive answer to your question, but the simple fact is I could not have written The Promise before these particular years had elapsed, because the Promise is charting the decline of that sense of promise, essentially, the fullness of what was on offer back in 1994. And, it very much needs to end up, with the Zuma years and, the point that South Africa's reached in its fall from grace, if you like. For that trajectory to make sense, I needed the full span of my adult life, which carries us pretty much to the present day. So I don't think I was actively avoiding it, but that perhaps my literary instincts knew that, the time was not right for such a book.
In this golden time, we didn't just before the pandemic, you and I drove for a number of days. You drove, I did the talking for a number of days in South Africa, starting out from Cape Town. And I suppose the question, that there's an Irish poem called The Battle of Aughrim by Richard Murphy, and it opens with this, I think, a great phrase that you could almost ask anywhere you go, say, who owns this land, is the opening of that poem. And it was a question that arose very often as we were driving along, thinking, this is the most beautiful place I have ever been. The way the sun, especially towards sunset, hits rock, the sort of redness, the sort of glow, the astonishing beauty. Astonishing beauty. And I kept wondering, but who owns this? And the idea of ownership, who owns it in some spiritual way? And who owns it in law? And who will give it up? And how could it ever be divided properly? And so the Promise really centers around this whole idea of land. It's not it's not a metaphor. It is the most pressing matter in your country, and it is the matter that is dramatized in your book. So you've moved right into the very center of the argument. Who owns this land?
You actually gave me a bout of goose flesh with the way you said that. And you brought a few tears to my eyes in the description of the landscape. Yes, it's setting a kind of cold political question against a different sort of association altogether, which is much more visceral. Yes, it is the central question in South Africa now, and it's one that's on the lips of quite a few politicians, one way or another. Who owns this land? Who has a claim to it? Who took it from whom rather? And who will own it in the future? All of these are very, very central to South African cultural. Well, it's not even cultural life. South African life, in every sort of way, for very obvious reasons. I don't profess to have the answer to that. Clearly, white settlers from Europe took land from people who already occupied it. That's indisputable. How do you redress historical wrongs like that were not committed in your lifetime, not even in your father or your grandfather's lifetime? The sins of the fathers go back a long way, and perhaps in other countries they've been resolved one way or another. Here, not at all. That strand of the book, which actually gives the book its title, The Promise, came from an entirely separate anecdote that another friend told me about how his mother on her deathbed, when he was still a teenager, had made his family promise that they would give a scrappy little piece of land with a sort of broken down house on it to the black lady who had looked after his mother through her last illness. And his family had found ways in the most ingenious South African tradition not to follow through on this promise that they'd undertaken. And it had really been a torment for my friend. And this particular issue had recently been resolved, which is why he was unburdening himself to me about it. I was already working on the book, and it sort of came to me as a late thought, really, that I mean, the story in itself, it's something that happened, to a friend and his family, and to the lady who worked for them. But it's also a story that's being repeated right now all over the country in multiple forms and in multiple situations. So it struck me as a strand that I could pull through the 4 panels of the book, and keep as a question that was central to the book in the same way that it's central to South Africa. So yeah, it's also a question that you can resolve in a book, but not necessarily in life quite as easily. But I hope that the resolution I found in the book leaves a sense that it's just as difficult in real life to bring a resolution to this matter.
One of the very dramatic and sharp moments in the book occurs almost as an aside, but it stays with the reader, I think, quite a lot. You find another example of it, say, in a play like Brian Friel's Translations, which occurs in the Irish 19th century when the language is changing from Irish to English. And there are twins mentioned in the book. They don't ever appear in the play. They don't ever mention it. They don't ever appear. But they're the ones who are maiming the horses. They're the ones who are damaging the army. They're the ones who are in the background, who come out at night. And they don't appear, but nonetheless, the sense of them that they're the ones who are going to become the next generation. They're the dangerous ones. And that fear is always there. And in your novel, you have the son of the black woman. And even though he doesn't speak much, he becomes quite, I think, a powerful figure in the book because he suggests a future. And that future seems very dangerous. And he's quite determined. And he's quite an interesting figure in the book because I think he really does fill a lot of space, despite the fact that he's very subtly treated. He doesn't appear in every scene shouting and roaring. He's just there. And we know what he means.
Yeah, I wanted to trace his trajectory in a certain way, but far more likely, I guess, than some of the other characters. We first see him in the first section where he's a child, the same age as Amor, who's the youngest daughter in the family. And they have an essentially childish conversation about the house that his mother has supposedly been left. And there's an innocence to the conversation, I hope, and a lack of weight, which is what a childhood conversation might contain. But by the end of the book, as you say, I give him the most confrontational and angry words in the book, where both he and Amor are much older, not children anymore, and several decades of politics and history have intervened to place them on either side of a great divide. And he speaks to her across this divide with very angry words. The words were not difficult to create because you hear them in South Africa quite often these days. And they are mostly from a younger generation. And although they're radical, they are also in a certain way reasonable. It's a strain of thinking that says we're nearly 30 years past the end of apartheid, nearly 30 years into democracy, and what has changed? If you look at the economy of this country, it has kept people exactly where they were. By far the most people with money and land and wealth, as distinct from money, are white people. And by far the majority of people who are dispossessed or own next to nothing are people of color. That ought to be different. In the simplest, most basic way, that ought to be different. And Lucas's position, this particular character, is that we're going to take it. It belongs to us. It was taken from us. We're going to take it back. And raw and brutal though it is, it's a very audible part of the South African conversation at the moment. So, where that conversation might still lead us, I don't know, but I definitely wanted to provide him with a platform and let the future speak, the future as you very well put it.
I want to go back to prose. And we're going to take questions in a few minutes, so that in the Q&A, if you can type a question in, then we'll deal with the question there. But this is if someone asked a question, yes, I know this book is about politics, and I know it's tempting to do something new with perspective in prose narrative. Is there some other reason why I should really read this book? And I want to answer that, and basically by asking you a question, which I'll come to in a minute. I'll answer it first by saying, what's interesting, and I wonder how much thought you put into this, or how, again, it happened organically on its own, is how untidy the book is. In other words, it isn't as though every piece of story in the book is designed to be part of a pattern that will show how this promise was broken, how whites are living in the new South Africa. That in other words, you could really write a novel just setting out all the numbers and coloring them in various shades, and you would have the South African novel that would tell the story of the broken promise and of the white family. But actually what your book does is it gives us character, scene, and moment with all sorts of untidy edges and truthfulness in relation to how experience is, even how experience is in fiction. And that there are lovely moments that you feel, oh my God, he's sailed away from his own direction. He's gone backwards, or something has occurred to one of the characters, or they do something that has nothing whatsoever to do with an overall design, an overall sense of what this novel should be. So it really has a lovely feel to it, in that it isn't and I think this is part of maybe what's also happening in the perspective question, or the interjection question, is that it isn't an author designing a novel to fit life and to say this is my, in a way, controlling version of what is. But rather you cede control, you give control away, you let the story go in various directions. So there is a sort of delight in reading it, in that you're following something that isn't predetermined. That's a very long question. I promise you it's going to end now by saying, could you comment on this, or is this something that is there a theory of this?
Yeah, I understand why so much of the reading of the book, the readings of the book, have centered on the history, the politics of it. Obviously, that's central to South Africa and apparently central to the book too. But to me, honestly, I was trying with this book to give voice to something a little different, and I would hope a little bit larger, in the sense that, I'm nearly 60, and I spend a lot of time thinking about what my life has meant to me, obviously not to anyone else. But I was trying with this book to give expression or give voice to my sense of how my life has felt to me. I'm sorry, that sounds terribly grand, but this thing of moving from one perspective to another is part of how I experience, time and consciousness as something that, flickers and moves from one strand to another. So I really wasn't trying to write a politically saturated book, even an historically saturated book. For me, that was just one strand of it. I was trying to give a sense of how it's felt to me to live in this country through the past 50 years, through the changes it's undergone, and how I feel about the changes of the country, but also the changes that I personally have undergone, my life, my face, my consciousness. So yeah, for me, the real subject of this book is time and one's passage through time. I know that sounds terribly grand, and a lot of people don't even recognize that in the reading of the book, but I'm frustrated by readings that see no further than the politics or the history. I'm trying to say a whole lot more.
Your Italian translator is here, Tiziana Loporto, and she's saying how and how much language is relevant for your writing. She said she's translating the book into Italian. Just wants you to talk about the idea, say, of the making of sentences, the revising of sentences, the creation of tone and, say, pace. Just help her. She's got to translate your book.
She's done it already, so it's a
right,
it's a question after the fact, but it's absolutely central to me. I mean, why I fell in love with books in the first place is because of what they do with language. It's the pleasure of words standing in for the world, and how you can make words sort of pull against each other to release a kind of poetry in them. It's absolutely central and hugely important to me. So that doesn't mean that one sits and belabors the sentences in a kind of self-punishing, mechanistic sort of way. It's about getting into a sort of mental zone with the writing where the language is first and foremost the thing that's driving you. I don't know how else to put it, but the pleasure of using words in unexpected and vivid ways to evoke the world for people, for myself in the writing too, is what impels me. If I was simply concocting stories with a moral or trying to create narratives that did only what journalism has already done for us, there would be no point. The language and the pleasures of language are really the main motive for writing any novel.
If I could just remind people to put anything into Q&A rather than chat. It's Q&A I'm able to open and see. And the first question that came into Q&A was, what do you think of J.M. Coetzee, and do you know him?
We have met a few times. I can't claim I know him in any intimate way. What do I think of him, meaning of his writing?
Yes, I think that's the question.
As I said, my first encounter with him was with In the Heart of the Country, and I was amazed and astounded by that book. And I went on to read, whatever else I could find of his. I think if South Africa's produced a truly great novel, it's probably Waiting for the Barbarians. No, he's a towering figure, and one that I've kind of struggled to stake out some of my own identity in relation to. I keep getting compared to him in a lazy sort of way, but he overshadows modern South African writing in a way that no other figure does.
Okay. It's a good question here. Interesting to find out about the origins of the land promise from you, about the wild woman made a promise to the land. So hold on, but asking you about the in your book, the chief vehicle for the promise is Amor, among other things, a lesbian. A lot has been written about the role of sexuality in your writing. How important was Amor's sexuality in carrying the narrative, especially the promise that her mother extracted from her father?
I'm trying to think back to my own reasoning. She herself doesn't think of herself as a lesbian, it has to be said. She has a moment towards the end where she thinks of the people she's loved, some men, some women. So presumably she's open to, various kinds of encounters. I wanted to set her experience implicitly against the far more patriarchally dominated relationships of people like her sister, Astrid. I mean, South Africa under apartheid was a rigid patriarchy, and it kind of deformed and distorted women's roles in ways that remain really uncomfortable. So I wanted Amor, I guess, to be a freer spirit and to open up other possibilities of behavior. But my attention was not primarily on, modes of sexual being with this book. That was really a relatively background concern.
There's a question asking you which character surprised you most in the making of this book.
I don't know, because I was surprised by various minor characters who suddenly intruded and wanted, some aspect of their story to be told. I had the most fun, most enjoyment in creating the character of Anton, who's the eldest brother. I think because he's firstly so self-aware, and secondly so tormented. I was, drawing on aspects of myself. I'll be honest about that. But I had a lot of fun in creating him, his kind of internal torment, and he was maybe not surprising, but he was an enjoyable creation for me.
Someone, Elizabeth Bear is asking a question. Could you comment on the mention of Lindquist's "Exterminate all the brutes" on page 278?
Well, of course, it actually comes from Conrad's Heart of Darkness. I wanted to offset it against the other quote on that page, "Kill the wizards," which actually comes from, supposedly, from a Zulu chieftain, Dingaan, who lured a bunch of white voortrekkers, so-called pioneers, so-called, into his encampment, and then under the guise of a negotiation, and then unleashed his troops on them with this instruction: kill the wizards. So I was evoking, let's say, South Africa at its most racially radical and extreme. On the one hand, "Exterminate all the brutes" is Colonel Kurtz in Heart of Darkness, or Kurtz rather. Colonel Kurtz comes from the Apocalypse Now, the movie. But Kurtz in Heart of Darkness basically handing down, the colonial injunction of exterminate the brutes, versus Dingaan of saying, let's kill the wizards. In other words, kill the settlers. So those are two polarized and very, very unappealing extreme edges of, you could say, South African history and the South African psyche.
There's an anonymous just asking that she's in a book club, and is there anything you would like us, a group of older white women, to consider when we discuss it?
Wow.
It's an interesting question, isn't it? I mean, is there any one thing that you would think, look, please pay attention to this?
Yeah, I don't know, but how about let me roll out an open-ended consideration and say, you might have a fruitful discussion about what the edges of the book are, which is to say, the parts of the book that are not laid out for you. What happens in the gaps between these funerals? How much of a presence, a literary presence, did those missing pages have for you? It may not, lead you anywhere, but that's certainly something I like to talk about. So you might have some discussion about it.
Here's a question I haven't seen you ask before. It's Andrea Lavire asking: the mother's return to her Judaism was a powerful opening to the book. How has your experience growing up in a Jewish family informed your writing and perspectives in South Africa?
Very little, I'm sorry to say, because although my father's Jewish, my mother converted to Judaism and converted me to Judaism at the age of 2. She then never followed through on raising us in that tradition. So I, in fact, don't speak Hebrew, never had a bar mitzvah, and so on. But I did want to reflect that aspect of, the white South African identity. Amusingly, at least to me, somebody pointed out to me the other day that I believe it's the Jerusalem Post or some Israeli newspaper reviewed the book. Had an article about the book saying, "Book about Jewish mother wins the Booker Prize." In fact, it's not about a Jewish mother, but she is certainly a character. I'm sorry, by way of an incidental note, that Judaism has not played a larger part in my upbringing. At least I would have an identity to rebel against, but I lack.
Damon, can I ask you a supplementary question there? I'm not suggesting you're evading this question, but surely it would make a difference in a country that's so divided, say with Afrikaans on one side, with the Dutch Reformed Church, with then on the other side the ANC, just say, and would being Jewish not really matter here?
Well, it matters in the sense that, well, you know, Judaism carries within it the seeds of philosophical thinking that is traditionally more sort of open and tolerant. And Jews are very often in the South African context of a far more liberal or open mindset than some of the other South Africans around. So yeah, it's not irrelevant, but I didn't try to build it into the book in that way.
Okay.
And yeah. Sorry.
Okay, that's fine. There's a question about the army. Were you in the army? And very little has been written about the effects of being scripted into the white South African army.
I did unfortunately do 2 years in the Air Force, not at all like Anton's experience. And I agree with you, it's an experience that for reasons I don't completely understand, has not really been processed by South Africa in the time afterward. If I think about America and how much Vietnam has been digested in the culture of America through movies and books and so on, it stands out how very, very little that similar experience has been on show in South Africa. I don't really know why. Yeah.
Just a final question. Leslie Hyde is asking, can you tell us about your next writing project?
I was busy with a book of short stories when the book of lightning struck. I'm not able really at the moment to keep on working on them, but I will return to them as soon as I can. But the idea is that I'll complete a book of short stories within the coming months, I hope.
Damon, Galgut, thank you very much. It was really great talking to you again. And we'll send it back. The books, obviously the copies of the book, The Promise, are available from Politics and Prose. And thank you very much, everybody, for coming and listening.
Thank you, Cohen.
And thank you both for joining us in this wonderful conversation. I want to thank you for being here. Thank everybody out in the audience for listening in. As you've heard, the book link to The Promise is in the chat. It will take you to the Politics and Prose website. And after you've purchased the book, while you're there, you can visit our events page. We'd love to see you at another event soon. In the meantime, thank you again for coming. Stay well and well read.